The sledgehammer came down for the ninth time before I even got the garage door open, and by the time I did, my son was standing in the wreckage of 40 years, laughing at something his wife had just said behind her phone. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. I heard the crack of splintering wood through the door before I saw anything. My key stuck in the lock the way it always did in cold weather, and I remember thinking absurdly that I needed to get that fixed before winter. Then the door swung open, and I understood that a fixed lock wasn't going to matter anymore. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 62 years old, and for 38 of those years I have restored furniture and instruments for people who could no longer find anyone else willing to do the work right. Museums called me. Estate lawyers called me. A concert cellist once drove 11 hours from Montreal because she'd heard I was the only person left in New England who still knew how to rebuild a 19th century bridge by hand. My workshop sat behind my house outside Ashford, Vermont, a converted barn my wife Eleanor and I had poured a new concrete floor for the year after we married. 34 years ago, she used to joke that I loved that barn more than I loved her, and I used to tell her that wasn't true. It was a close second. Eleanor died 2 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed too late to matter. In the months after, the workshop became the only place I could stand to be. I rebuilt the floor that spring, the old concrete having cracked from decades of settling, and I poured a new slab myself, on my knees, alone, at 59 years old, because I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't grief. What I put beneath that concrete before I sealed it is not something I am ready to tell you yet. I'll tell you this much. It mattered more than anything my son destroyed that afternoon, and he had no idea it was 6 inches beneath his boots the entire time he was swinging that hammer. My son's name is Dean. He's 31. His wife is Jessica, 28. And she has built what she calls a lifestyle brand out of documenting what she describes online as her husband's toxic, emotionally withholding father. I didn't know that phrase existed about me until the day her camera turned toward my face while I was bleeding on my own garage floor. The sound that stopped me at the door was Jessica's voice, high and delighted. "Get the workbench, babe. Get the one with his initials burned into it. Show them what this guy actually cares about." I pushed the door open. What I saw made my knees buckle, in a way I am not ashamed to admit, even now, even to strangers listening to this story. 38 years of my working life lay scattered across the concrete like the aftermath of a building collapse. The set of ivory-handled carving chisels I'd inherited from my own father snapped at the tang, their brass ferrules bent flat. A restoration bench I'd built the year Dean was born split down the grain where the hammer had caught it edge on. Glass jars of hide glue, some of them older than Dean himself, shattered across the floor. The smell of scorched animal protein and 80-year-old varnish thick enough to burn my throat. And in the center of it, my son, sledgehammer raised over his head, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, a grin on his face that belonged to someone I did not recognize. "Dean, stop." My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "The Ferris Commission is due Thursday. Those are client instruments in the back corner. People are trusting me with things that belong to their grandparents." He turned toward me, and the way he angled his body, chin up, shoulders squared, like he was hitting a mark on a stage, told me before he even spoke that this had been planned, rehearsed, even. "Look who finally showed up," he said. "The great Walter Briggs, master craftsman. Tell your fans how you couldn't spare $40,000 for your own son's business, but you've got a barn full of antique junk you love more than your family." Jessica swung her phone toward me. Her nails were the same shade of red as the emergency exit signs at the hospital I would end up in 3 hours later. "Guys, you are not going to believe this. This is the man who let his son's construction company go bankrupt rather than help. Look at this. Look at all this stuff he cares about more than his own blood." I stepped forward, glass grinding under my boots. Every step was a piece of my life turning to dust beneath me. "Dean, please, this isn't about money. You never asked me for money. If you had asked, I asked." His voice cracked. And for 1 second, 1 single second, I saw something underneath the rage that looked almost like a child. "I asked you in March. You said you needed to think about it." You've never had to think about anything in your life except which piece of dead wood to save next. He swung again. This time at the bench Eleanor used to sit on while she read to me in the evenings, her feet tucked under her, telling me to slow down, that the wood would still be there in the morning. It split in half with a sound like a gunshot. I lunged for the hammer without thinking. We grappled for it, his hands younger and stronger than mine, and somewhere in that struggle his fist connected with my jaw. Hard enough that white light tore across my vision and the floor came up to meet me. I don't remember falling so much as I remember the cold of the concrete against my cheek, and Jessica's voice delighted, distant. This is content gold. Karma finally comes for the greedy old man. This is going to break 100,000 views. Blood filled my mouth. Somewhere behind me, glass sliced into my palm as I tried to push myself up, and I registered distantly that this was the same corner of the floor where I had knelt 2 years ago with a trowel and a bag of quick-set concrete, doing something I had never told a living soul about. Dean kept swinging. The humidity cabinet I'd built for storing veneer, gone. The Stradivarius copy I'd been restoring for a young violinist in Burlington. Its case popped open, the instrument itself skidding across the floor and coming to rest against the leg of a ruined workbench, its neck snapped clean. "That's a client's violin," I said, or tried to say, through a mouthful of blood. "That belongs to a 16-year-old girl." "Then tell her to sue you," Dean said. "Everybody else does." That was when Frank Doyle's voice cut through the barn like a rifle shot. "Dean Briggs, put it down now." Frank had lived next door to us for 11 years. 26 years with the Vermont State Police before he retired, and even at 68, something in his posture still carried the weight of a badge. He crossed the wreckage toward me with the calm, fast efficiency of a man who had done this before, checking my pulse, my pupils, the gash across my palm, while Jessica pivoted her phone to catch him too. "Ooh, look. Another old man riding in to save the day. Are you getting this, babe?" "Every second," Dean said, and dropped the hammer at last, letting it clang against the concrete. "We're done here anyway. Got everything we needed." He stepped over the ruined violin. I heard the bridge crack under his boot and walked toward the door without looking back. "Let's go, Jess." Let the old man cry over his toys. Jessica lowered her phone just long enough to check something on the screen, her face lighting up. 41,000 people watching. "Babe. We're trending." They left through the door they'd forced open with a crowbar. The same crowbar Dean had used, ironically, on a job I'd bought him for his 18th birthday. Frank already had his phone out, dialing. "No," I said, grabbing his wrist. "Let them go. Walter, this is assault. This is felony property damage. You need to. Let them go, Frank." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I have a plan, and it doesn't start with a phone call tonight." He didn't understand it then. He would understand it eventually. But that night, all he could do was help me into his truck and drive me to Ashford General, while I stared out the window and did math in my head. Catalog losses, the way I'd been trained to catalog every crack and chip in a piece of furniture before I ever touched it with a tool. At the hospital, they put 7 stitches in my palm and told me my ribs were bruised, not broken, and that I likely had a mild concussion. A young doctor asked twice how this had happened, and both times I told her I'd fallen while working. She didn't believe me. She didn't push either. A state trooper named Officer Reyes came by while they were wrapping my ribs, notebook in hand, telling me Frank had already called it in as an assault regardless of what I wanted. I gave a statement that was true in every particular except the parts I chose to leave soft around the edges. "Family dispute," I said. "I'll handle the rest privately." He left his card and told me I had time to change my mind about pressing charges. Frank drove me home as the sky went gray with early morning, lecturing me the entire way about how I was going to regret protecting a man who had just broken my face. I let him talk. My mind was 3 steps ahead of him already, moving through a plan that had started forming the moment I saw my son's face and realized, with a kind of terrible clarity, that this had not been an accident of anger. This had been staged, planned, timed for an audience. The workshop looked worse in daylight than it had in the chaos of the night before. I stood in the doorway at 6 in the morning, my hand throbbing under its bandage, and forced myself to walk the wreckage inch by inch with my phone camera, documenting everything before I let myself feel any of it. That's when I found the box, not the one under the floor. That one was still safe, still sealed, still 6 inches beneath the ruined concrete near the east wall, exactly where Eleanor and I had left it. This was a smaller box, a cheap plastic one I didn't recognize, half hidden behind an overturned shelf near the door. Inside it were burner phones, 3 of them, and a spiral notebook filled with Dean's handwriting. I sat down on an overturned stool with my bandaged hand shaking and read what my son had been planning for 11 weeks. There were dates. There were dollar figures. There was a line, underlined twice, that read, "Dad won't press charges. He never has. Use that." He was right and he was wrong, both at the same time, and by the time the sun was fully up over the tree line, I had already called my attorney, a woman named Diane Coleman, who had handled every piece of business paperwork I'd touched for 15 years. "Walter, it's 6:30 in the morning," she said when she picked up. "Please tell me you're calling about the Ferris estate." "I need a full legal and financial separation from my son," I said. "Today, if you can manage it. I have video evidence of assault, I have a notebook proving premeditation, and I think when we dig deeper, we're going to find he's been forging my signature." There was a long silence on the line. "How deep does deeper go?" "I don't know yet," I said, looking down at the notebook in my lap. At a page where Dean had practiced my signature 17 times in a row, each one closer to mine than the last. "But I intend to find out." "I'll clear my morning," Diane said. 9 o'clock. Bring everything." I hung up and opened a new document on my laptop with my one good hand, the cursor blinking on an empty page. I typed a single word at the top, and it took me a long time to make myself finish typing it, because I understood, even then, what it would cost. Recovery. Underneath it, I built 3 columns. Evidence. Legal. And a third column I stared at for almost a full minute before I let myself write it. Because writing it made it real in a way that simply thinking it had not. Consequences. Behind me, in the ruined shell of my workshop, the concrete near the east wall sat undisturbed, the way it had sat undisturbed for 2 years, holding a secret that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the son I had once believed I was raising. I did not know yet how long it would take before I was ready to dig it back up. I only knew that whatever happened between now and then, that box was going to outlast every version of Dean that showed up to hurt me, and it was going to be there, waiting on the other side of all of it. Diane Coleman's office took up the 4th floor of a converted mill building in downtown Ashford, all exposed brick and law books that smelled like the archives at the historical society I used to volunteer for. I sat across from her desk with my bandaged hand resting on a flash drive containing everything Frank and I had gathered overnight, and for the first time since the sledgehammer came down, I let myself feel the full weight of what I was about to do. "Show me," Diane said, the way she always did when a client tried to explain something instead of proving it. I played the footage from the barn's security camera, the one hidden inside an old cuckoo clock on the high shelf, installed 8 months earlier after tools had started disappearing from the shop. Diane's professional composure held until the moment the hammer connected with my jaw on screen. Her pen stopped drumming against the legal pad. It didn't start again for almost 30 seconds. "Property damage alone is going to exceed $180,000, she said finally, pulling up Vermont statutes on her second monitor. "The assault is straightforward battery." "But Walter," she held up a lease document from the stack I'd brought, one I didn't recognize. "This signature isn't yours." My good hand curled into a fist on my knee. "Dean's been signing my name. I found the notebook this morning. I don't know how deep it goes yet." She studied the forged signature against 3 authentic ones I'd brought as comparison, her pen tracing the loops. "This isn't clumsy. Look at the pressure, the flow. Somebody practiced this for a long time." She looked up at me. "This is federal territory now, Walter. Identity theft, wire fraud, potentially. If any of these documents crossed a bank, make it slow," I said. "I don't want him blindsided in one afternoon. I want him to feel every step of it arrive." Diane nodded like she'd been waiting for me to say exactly that. "Vermont requires proper notice on any tenancy issue. We'll start there." The civil suit for property damage will take months to resolve, which gives the criminal side time to build properly. Her fingers were already moving across her keyboard. I want you at First Vermont Trust after this. We need a complete audit of every account with your name on it. The bank sat 2 blocks from Diane's office, and the branch manager, a woman named Marion Voss, who had known me since I financed the barn renovation 15 years earlier, stood up so fast when she saw my bruised jaw that her chair rolled back into the wall. Walter, my God, are you? I need to see every account, every card, everything with my name attached to it. She pulled up my records, and I watched her expression shift from concern to something closer to alarm as she scrolled. There's a cash advance from yesterday morning, $5,000. Did you authorize that? I laughed, and it came out uglier than I intended. Cancel everything. Every card, every line of credit, every access point this institution has ever given him. Your son was here an hour before you arrived, Marion said quietly, glancing toward the door as though he might still be lingering outside. He seemed upset when his card was declined at the ATM out front. The credit report she pulled a few minutes later showed 3 cards I had never applied for, each one carrying a balance, each one listing Dean as an authorized user added within the last 14 months. $28,000 in debt I had never spent a cent of. I signed form after form with my stitched hand cramping around the pen, 2 hours of what felt like a slow, methodical amputation of every financial thread that still connected me to my son. Marion didn't ask questions. She'd been in banking long enough to recognize the look on my face for what it was. That evening, Frank came by with a 6-pack he didn't open and sat with me on the porch steps while I told him what Diane had found, what the bank had found, what I was building toward. You know what I keep thinking about, Frank said, staring out at the tree line where the light was fading gold over the hills. 26 years I did this job. Domestic disputes, property crimes, the whole ugly parade of it. And every single time the family always thinks the money's the thing. It's never the money, Walter. Money's just the excuse they give themselves for the part underneath. The part they can't say out loud. What's the part underneath? Frank shrugged, the way he did when he'd already said more than he meant to. You'll figure it out. You always were the one who could see the grain under the finish. I didn't answer him. I was thinking about the notebook, about a line I hadn't shown Diane yet, buried 3 pages in, that read, "He never once told anyone I mattered as much as that stupid barn." I hadn't decided yet what to do with that sentence. I still haven't. Fully even now, 2 days passed in preparation. New locks on every door of the house, a security system with motion-triggered cameras replacing the ancient one in the cuckoo clock. Diane filed the eviction notice on the rental house. Dean and Jessica shared across town, 30 days notice as Vermont law required, served by a process server who caught Dean on his lunch break outside the framing company where he'd been picking up day labor since his own construction business folded 8 months earlier. I hadn't known that detail until Diane's investigator dug it up. Briggs Construction, Dean's company, the one he'd named after himself with what I remember at the time, being a strange kind of pride. 2 employees, both let go in the spring. A single unfinished job site outside of town, a half-built deck abandoned when the client stopped paying after Dean missed 3 deadlines in a row. I sat with that information longer than I expected to. He'd never told me. Not once. In all the months his business was dying, had he called to say he was struggling. He'd called instead to ask, once, in March, if I could lend him $40,000 for a piece of equipment. I'd told him I needed a few days to think about the terms, about whether it should be a loan or a gift, about how to structure it so it didn't damage either of us if things went wrong. 3 days later, he stopped answering my calls. I hadn't known those 3 days were the last ordinary days I would ever have with my son. That knowledge didn't stop what came next. It only changed the shape of it a little, softened one corner of my resolve, even as I sharpened the rest. On the 3rd night, motion sensors lit up the backyard at 8 in the evening, and I sat in my darkened living room with a new recorder in my shirt pocket, waiting. Jessica's voice carried through the night air first, bright and performative even in the dark. Get all of this. Show them how he's locking his own son out of his childhood home. The back door rattled. Dean still had the old set of lockpicks I'd taught him to use myself years ago for a summer job restoring antique cabinet hardware, never imagining he'd turn that skill against me. The picks didn't work on the new mechanism. "Open up, old man." His boot connected with the door hard enough that the frame shuddered. I stood, walked to the door, and did not open it. "It's not yours yet, Dean. I'm still breathing. We'll destroy you online. Every follower Jessica has will know exactly what kind of father." "Please do," I said. And I meant it in a way that seemed to catch him off guard, because there was a pause on the other side of the door before he spoke again. "My lawyer loves evidence. I know things, Dad. I know about the corner you cut on the Ferris job. I know clients who'd love to hear their grandmother's cello sat in a barn with a leaking roof for 6 months, while like you knew how to forge my signature 17 times before you got it right." I let the silence sit after that. "That's federal prison, Dean, 5 to 10 years. Ask your lawyer, when you get one, how sympathetic a jury feels about a man who beat his father and then robbed him." There was a long silence, and then Jessica's voice, thinner now, less certain. "He's bluffing, babe. He'd never actually." "I already have," I said, and closed the conversation by turning off the porch light. They left, but not before Dean kicked over the row of garbage cans by the garage, scattering trash across the driveway. I would spend the next morning cleaning up alone, one bag at a time, cataloging it as evidence, the same way I'd cataloged everything else. Let them believe this was rage. Rage was cheap. What I was building was patient, and patient things last longer. Thomas Fitzgerald, a claims investigator with Green Mountain Mutual, arrived the following afternoon to assess the damage for my insurance claim, a 20-year veteran who told me within the first 10 minutes that he'd seen arson, fraud, vandalism of every kind. "This," he said, standing in the middle of the wreckage, "is personal. I can always tell." I walked him through the inventory Diane and I had built, item by item, with photographs, receipts, and provenance documents going back decades. The set of ivory-handled chisels my father's, valued at $4,000 but genuinely irreplaceable. The humidity cabinet, $12,000 and 2 years of calibration, destroyed in under a minute. The Stradivarius copy belonging to a 16-year-old client, its neck snapped, valued at $9,000 for the instrument alone, though I made clear in my statement that no dollar figure could capture what it meant to have failed, a child who trusted me with something her grandfather had given her. Thomas paused longest at the ruined bench Eleanor used to sit on. "This one have a story too? My wife used to read to me while I worked," I said. "She's been gone 2 years. He made a note, and his expression shifted the way I'd noticed it shift on Marion, on Diane, on everyone who heard the full weight of what had been lost. "Sentimental value changes the claim parameters significantly," he said. "I'll note it." I hired a private investigator named Samuel Reyes the following week. On Diane's recommendation, a quiet, unhurried man who had spent a decade doing insurance fraud work before going independent. I gave him 3 things to look into: the full extent of Dean's financial forgeries, the truth behind Briggs Construction's collapse, and, because something in Jessica's carefully staged outrage never quite sat right with me, anything unusual in her recent movements. It took Samuel 11 days to bring back all 3 answers, and only one of them surprised me. The forgeries went back 3 years, not one, totaling $41,000 across 4 different accounts, all confirmed through a forensic handwriting examiner named Dr. Patricia Wong, whose narrow office sat wedged between a tax preparer and a bail bondsman 2 towns over. Under her UV light, the forged signatures glowed differently from my authentic ones, and she found something in a stack of papers Frank had pulled, with my blessing, from the trash outside Dean's rental house. 7 pages of Dean practicing my signature in careful, repetitive rows, like a student cramming for an exam he could never afford to fail. "This wasn't a moment of weakness," Dr. Wong told me, tapping the practice sheets. "This is dedication. He trained himself to do this. That takes months, sometimes longer." The construction company's collapse was simpler and, in its way, sadder. Dean had underbid 3 jobs in a row trying to compete with a larger contractor from Burlington. then covered the losses with the same cards he'd later use to charge Jessica's designer clothes and their trip to Atlantic City in June. He'd been drowning for the better part of a year, and instead of calling his father, he had called no one, until the debt collectors started calling him. The third thing Samuel found was about Jessica, and I want to be honest that I did not expect to feel anything when I read it, and I was wrong. She'd been photographed twice, at a hotel 40 minutes outside of Ashford, with a man named Chad Ellery, a fitness influencer with a modest following of his own. The dates lined up with 2 weekends. Dean had told me in better days that Jessica was at a content retreat with other creators. I sat with that folder open on my desk for a long time before I decided what, if anything, to do with it. You don't have to use it, Diane told me when I brought it to her office. It's not part of the criminal case, it's leverage. And leverage can curdle into cruelty if you're not careful about how you spend it. I'm not planning to use it to hurt her, I said. I'm planning to let the truth arrive when it's ready to arrive on its own. I just want to know when that's going to be, so I'm not standing in the wrong place when it does. Diane studied me for a moment. You've changed since Monday, Walter. I buried something 2 years ago, I said, and didn't explain further. And to her credit, she didn't ask. The eviction notice's 30 days ran out on a gray, drizzling morning in late October. I sat in my truck across the street with Frank beside me, watching 2 sheriff's deputies knock on the door of the rental house I now technically still owned, since Diane had confirmed my name remained on the original lease. Dean had never bothered to have transferred. One more piece of carelessness that would come back to matter later. Jessica appeared at the window first, phone already raised. This is harassment. We are being persecuted for daring to speak the truth about elder abuse. Dean emerged behind her, and I noticed, with a small, cold twist in my chest, that he was wearing my grandfather's pocket watch, the one I'd told him 100 times as a boy that it would be his someday, when he was ready to understand what it meant to carry something that had survived longer than the people who made it. Mr. Briggs, the lead deputy said, we're executing a lawful eviction order. You have 2 hours to remove your belongings. Through the front window, I watched Dean drag a couch in front of the door, pointless theatrics that delayed nothing. Neighbors gathered on porches up and down the street, some filming on their own phones now, a small audience assembling for a show that had already gone further than Dean and Jessica ever intended it to. This is illegal, Dean shouted through the glass. My father orchestrated this whole thing to humiliate me. Jessica had positioned herself for maximum effect, ring light glowing despite the gray daylight, her voice pitched for an audience she couldn't see. Look at this. They're throwing us out in the rain. Link in bio if you want to help us fight back against elder financial abuse. The deputies made short work of the couch barricade. Furniture began appearing on the wet lawn. Dean's gaming setup, worth close to $2,000, its components already beating with rain. Jessica's ring lights and camera tripods, so carefully arranged inside for her videos, now scattered across dead October grass. She stopped filming the moment her second tripod toppled into a puddle, and in that unguarded second, I saw something on her face that looked, for the first time since I'd met her, like fear rather than performance. That was when Samuel Reyes crossed the street, manila envelope in hand, timed exactly the way I'd asked him to time it. Dean Briggs? Dean, arms full of soaked clothing, looked up, confused. What? Who are you? Delivery for you. Samuel handed over the envelope and walked away without another word. Jessica swung her camera toward him, some instinct for content overriding whatever fear had briefly surfaced. What's that, babe? Is it from the lawyer? Dean tore it open. The photograph spilled into his hands, glossy, undeniable. Jessica entering a hotel with Chad Ellery. A hotel receipt with charges that had gone, I now knew, onto one of the fraudulent cards opened in my name. And the third photograph, the one that made Dean go completely still in the rain. Chad Ellery, wrist raised toward the camera in some influencer pose, wearing my grandfather's pocket watch's twin, the matching cufflinks I'd given Dean for his college graduation, the ones he'd told me, months earlier, had been stolen from their apartment. You gave those to Derek, Dean said, and his voice had lost every bit of its earlier fury, replaced by something smaller and more broken. 3 months? You've been with him 3 months? Those are fake, baby. Those are deep fakes. Someone is trying to. Jessica lunged for her own phone, forgetting the live stream was still running. Turn off the stream. No, Dean pushed her hand away. Let them see who you actually are for once. The viewer count, Samuel later told me, climbed past 12,000 before Jessica finally managed to end the broadcast, but not before the internet had already captured, downloaded, and begun circulating every second of it. I drove home in the rain without saying a word, and Frank, beside me, didn't try to fill the silence either. Some victories don't need narration. They only need time, and I had already learned, over the preceding 3 weeks, that I had more patience left in me than I had ever suspected. What I didn't yet know, sitting in that truck with the windshield wipers ticking back and forth, was that in 6 weeks' time I would be kneeling in a parking garage at midnight, with my hand pressed against my son's bleeding side, discovering exactly how much of him I still had left to lose, and exactly how much of that buried box beneath my workshop floor I would finally decide he deserved to see. The video of Dean's collapse in the rain spread faster than either Jessica or I anticipated. Local news picked it up within 2 days, a segment that ran during the 6 o'clock broadcast. And by the end of that week, Jessica's brand had lost most of what she'd spent 3 years building. Her follower count fell from 60,000 to under 20. The comeback post she attempted, soft lighting, a trembling apology about growth and toxic influences, was buried under thousands of comments quoting the live stream back at her, word for word. Detective Lena Marsh, from the State Police Financial Crimes Unit, called me in during the second week of November. She laid photographs and bank timelines across her desk, with the same patient thoroughness Diane had shown weeks earlier. 3 institutions confirmed fraudulent applications tied to your identity, she said. We have his fingerprints on physical documents, a confession on video from the live stream where he admits to destroying your property, and Dr. Wong's forensic analysis. We have enough for an arrest warrant, Mr. Briggs. I need you to understand what signing off on this means. I looked at the paperwork for a long moment, and what came to me unbidden wasn't rage. It was Dean at 5 years old, sitting on an overturned bucket in the barn, sanding a scrap of pine with a piece of sandpaper too coarse for the job, so proud of the rough, uneven edge he'd made that he'd carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table like a trophy. I signed the warrant anyway. Some kinds of love don't cancel out the need for consequences. Sometimes they require it. They arrested Dean on a Tuesday morning outside the framing company, where he'd been picking up occasional day labor. He didn't resist. Samuel, who was watching from across the street at my request, told me later that Dean had simply stood there and let the cuffs go on, his face empty in a way that unsettled even a man as unflappable as Samuel. The civil suit moved through the courts over the following months while the criminal case built toward trial. Green Mountain Mutual initially offered 30% of my claim, citing a family dispute exclusion clause, until Diane produced the confession footage and quietly mentioned the phrase bad faith denial, along with the name of a reporter who'd already shown interest in the story. The offer rose to 70% within a week, $126,000 delivered with an unsigned NDA I refused to touch, and a written apology I insisted on in its place. Dean pleaded guilty in March, in a courtroom that smelled like every courtroom I'd ever set foot in, floor wax and old paper. Judge Miriam Okafor read the charges in a voice that carried 30 years of having heard every excuse a defendant could offer. Identity theft, fraud exceeding $40,000, destruction of property exceeding $180,000. Assault, Mr. Briggs, she said to Dean. This court has reviewed the evidence at length, and I want to be clear about something before I pass sentence. This was not a single moment of poor judgment. This was systematic. You spent months preparing to deceive and harm the person who raised you, and you did so while recording it for an audience, which tells this court that on some level you wanted to be seen doing it. I find that more troubling than the crime itself. She sentenced him to 3 years of probation, $115,000 in restitution at 18% interest, and 300 hours of community service. The felony conviction would follow him for the rest of his working life. No professional license. No corporate employer willing to overlook a background check. No apartment complex that ran the standard screening. In the courthouse hallway afterward, reporters hovering with phones raised. Dean cornered me near the elevators, his public defender trailing behind him with the resigned look of a man who had lost this fight before it started. "You destroyed my whole future," he said, voice shaking. "Over tools, over wood. I'm your son." "Biology doesn't erase accountability," I said, the same 6 words I had turned over in my mind every night since the sentencing hearing had been scheduled. "You destroyed the future the moment you decided a hammer and an audience were more important than asking your father for help like a grown man." He didn't have a response to that. I watched something in his face fold inward. And then Frank stepped between us, gently, the way he always had, and walked me toward the parking lot. Without another word needing to be said, spring became summer. I sold the badly damaged rental property Dean and Jessica had once shared through Diane's paralegal and a small anonymous holding company she'd set up for me at a county tax auction after months of unpaid rent following the eviction. The winning bid was $49,000. Dean had no idea. Months later, when his rental application for a studio apartment across town came back listing the property owner as Briar Hollow Holdings LLC, that the anonymous company was mine. The property manager I'd hired called to relay the story with barely concealed disbelief. "Your son's application came in, Mr. Briggs." When we ran the ownership records against him, he just sat there staring at the paperwork. Asked us twice if the owner knew who he was. "Tell him the owner requires first month, last month, and a security deposit," I said. "No exceptions." By early June, Dean had lost the day labor work at the framing company. A felony conviction made even that arrangement untenable once the owner's insurance company found out. And he was down to warehouse shifts at a distribution center outside town. Paid under a temp agency that didn't run deep background checks. Sleeping some nights in his car when he fell behind on the studio rent he didn't know was flowing back to me. I watched all of this from a careful distance, through Samuel's periodic reports, through Frank's occasional sighting of Dean's battered pickup parked outside the food bank on Tuesdays. I want to tell you I felt nothing watching my son fall this far. I would be lying. What I felt instead was the ache of a man watching a piece of ruined furniture and knowing, with certainty, that it could still be restored if someone with patience and skill were willing to do the slow, unglamorous work of it. I had spent my entire career believing that nothing was too far gone to save if you were honest about what it would cost to save it. I decided, sitting alone in my rebuilt workshop one evening in late June, that I was not ready to stop believing that about my son, even if I wasn't ready to forgive him yet either. I called Nathaniel Cross, who owned Cross and Row Antiques 2 towns over, and who I'd known and traded restoration work with for 20 years. "I need a favor that's going to sound strange," I told him. "You've never asked me for a favor in 20 years, Walter. Say whatever you need to say." I explained the warehouse job I wanted him to create. Inventory management for his restoration supply stock, no access to the workshop floor, no access to clients, minimum wage, and a set of conditions that I would draft with Diane's help. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. "You want to hire your own son and make it as hard as possible for him. I want to give him a door that isn't locked," I said. "But I'm not going to hand him a key. He's going to have to earn every inch of that hallway." The contract Diane drafted was as unforgiving as any document I've ever signed. $230,000 total debt, the restitution combined with what remained owed to me directly, repaid through 60% wage garnishment after taxes, with a 5-year minimum repayment schedule. Instant termination for any tardiness, any insubordination, any additional legal trouble. No access to tools, clients, or the restoration floor. A clause prohibiting him from disclosing our relationship to any coworker. Mandatory drug testing. Though Dean had never once, to my knowledge, touched a substance stronger than the domestic beer he used to drink on the porch as a teenager, home from his first summer job. Proud of himself in a way I hadn't seen since. Dean sat across from Diane's desk in borrowed clothes the week the contract was presented, his hand still healing, though I didn't yet know from what, trembling slightly as he initialed each clause. He signed at the bottom without a word. No handshake crossed the table. Diane's paralegal witnessed the signature, and Dean left the office alone. If he claims discrimination based on family status, Diane warned me afterward, this could unravel. You need every hour of this documented. It will be, I said. This isn't personal anymore, Diane, it's business. She studied me for a moment, the way she'd taken to doing more and more over the preceding months. Walter, I've known you 15 years. I don't think you've ever said a sentence in your life that was less true than that one. I didn't argue with her. I only drove home and stood for a long while at the edge of the concrete floor near the east wall of my rebuilt workshop, thinking about the box still sealed beneath it, and about how much longer I intended to wait before I let my son see what was actually underneath all of this. Dean started at the warehouse at 5:30 each morning, 30 minutes before his shift technically began. According to the security logs Nathaniel forwarded me weekly at my request. Inventory counts, shipping labels, cleaning duties, whatever grunt work needed doing. He ate lunch alone on the loading dock most days, watching the restoration floor through the glass partition, though he never once, in the logs I reviewed, tried to enter it. His first paycheck arrived the first week of July. $2,200 gross became $880 after garnishment, and I watched, through the account records Diane had arranged access to as part of the repayment structure, as the full remainder went toward the debt without protest, without a single missed payment. I passed him once in the warehouse parking lot in mid-July, there to drop off restoration supplies for Nathaniel personally, something I did rarely enough that it wasn't suspicious. Dean was loading pallets, his frame thinner than I remembered, his clothes hanging loose in a way that told me he wasn't eating well. He looked up and saw me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Then he went back to the pallets, and I went back to my truck, and that was the entire exchange. I want to tell you that was the end of it, that the story simply wound down from there into quiet, orderly restitution. It nearly did. But on the last Tuesday of August, everything nearly ended differently. I'd stayed late at Nathaniel's gallery, finishing restoration work on an 18th century writing desk, and I was crossing the darkened parking structure toward my truck around 9 in the evening when two men came out of the shadows between the concrete pillars. One of them had a knife, catching the dim light from a broken overhead fixture. Wallet. Keys now, old man. I don't know what instinct made my hand go for the small restoration knife I still carried in my jacket pocket out of 40 years of habit, but it wasn't enough. The second attacker moved faster than I could react, the blade already arcing toward my ribs, and I understood, in the half-second before it landed, that I was about to be badly hurt in a parking garage 2 towns from home with no one nearby to hear me. Dean came out of nowhere. I didn't know until later that he'd been finishing a late shift at a second job he'd taken on without telling anyone. Walking the same route home he always walked, and had recognized my truck parked in the far corner. He tackled the man with the knife with a kind of desperate, reckless fury I hadn't seen in him since he was a teenager, and the two of them went down hard against the concrete. The blade meant for my side found Dean's instead, opening a gash across his ribs that soaked through his shirt within seconds. The attackers fled. Dean slid down against a concrete pillar, one hand pressed hard against his own side, blood already dark between his fingers. "Don't move," I said, dropping beside him, pressing my jacket against the wound with one hand while I dialed for help with the other, my voice somehow steadier than I felt. "Stay with me, Dean. Look at me. Couldn't let them hurt you," he whispered, his eyes losing focus. "Whatever I am, whatever I did, I'm still your son." The ambulance took 11 minutes that felt like an hour. I rode with him, my hands still red with his blood, insisting despite the paramedics' protests. At the hospital, they told me the knife had nicked his liver, that he needed surgery immediately, and I signed every financial responsibility form without a moment's hesitation. The same hand that had once signed a warrant for his arrest, now signing to save his life. He woke near dawn, morphine loosening something in him that 3 years of silence had kept sealed shut. "Been jealous of that workshop since I was 7 years old," he said, staring at the ceiling tiles rather than at me. "You loved those tools more than you loved me. That's what it felt like, anyway. I love teaching you to use them, I said. You're the one who stopped showing up to learn. Jessica saw how angry I already was. She just knew how to point it somewhere. He turned his head slightly toward me, but I chose to swing that hammer. I chose every signature I forged. That part was all me, Dad. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. I sat with him a long time, in the gray hospital light, remembering Dean at 7, sanding his first real piece of wood at my side, tongue caught between his teeth in concentration, and Dean at 13, suddenly declaring that my work was old-fashioned and boring, and Eleanor's voice, somewhere in the years between those two memories, telling me softly that children sometimes have to walk all the way to the edge of losing everything before they understand what they actually wanted to keep. I'm not asking you to forgive what I did, Dean said quietly. I know what I destroyed can't just be rebuilt because I said sorry in a hospital bed. No, I agreed, it can't. But 3 days later, sitting in Diane's office once his wound had healed enough to allow it, I brought a second document with me, one I hadn't told Diane I was drafting. Not forgiveness. Not yet. A modification, reduced garnishment, contingent on continued perfect attendance, and, for the first time, limited supervised access to the restoration floor to work alongside me directly one afternoon a week. Proving ground, I told Nathaniel when he raised an eyebrow at the arrangement. Not absolution. Opportunity. Dean started Thursday afternoons in September, standing at a workbench 3 feet from mine, relearning under my direct instruction the same French polishing technique he had once told me, at 16, was a waste of a life. His hands were clumsy with it, at first, out of practice, trembling slightly from the healing wound in his side. I corrected his grip the way I had corrected it 20 years earlier, and he didn't argue this time. In October, Portland Community College, no, Ashford Community College, held its annual Craft Heritage Evening, and I was asked to accept a Regional Preservation Award for lifetime restoration work. The ceremony broadcast locally and picked up briefly by a statewide outlet still following the story that had gone viral a year earlier. I stood at a podium in Eleanor's favorite of my old suits, $25,000 in prize money earmarked for a scholarship fund. I'd established in her name for foster youth interested in the restoration trades. Dean sat in the back row. I knew without turning around. I felt his presence the way you feel a draft from a door left slightly open. He didn't approach me afterward. He didn't need to. Standing at that podium, talking about restoration rather than revenge, about what it means to save something everyone else has already decided is beyond repair, I understood that this ceremony, public, witnessed, applauded, was only half of what this story required. The other half was waiting under 6 inches of concrete in my workshop, and I had put off dealing with it for exactly as long as I needed my son to become someone worth showing it to. 2 weeks after the ceremony, on a cold Saturday morning in late October, I asked Dean to come out to the workshop an hour before his usual Thursday session, alone, no explanation given. He arrived nervous, clearly expecting some new condition added to his contract, some fresh consequence. Instead, I handed him a sledgehammer. He stared at it, then at me, his face going pale in a way that told me he understood, on some level, exactly what kind of symmetry I was asking him to complete. There's a section of floor near the east wall, I said. I need you to break it open, carefully. Just that section. Dad, what? Just do it, Dean. He worked slowly, almost reverently, nothing like the wild swings of a year earlier, chipping away at the concrete I had poured myself 2 years before, until the head of a rusted steel box came into view, sealed in plastic sheeting, exactly where Eleanor and I had left it decades before that, back when Dean was small enough to still believe the barn was the safest place in the world. Inside were 3 things. A stack of old letters between Eleanor and me, written during a year we'd nearly separated before Dean was born, proof that our marriage had survived something dark, long before it ever produced. The family Dean grew up believing had always been effortless. A folded deed dated the year Dean turned 2, transferring the land beneath the barn, including whatever structure stood on it, into a trust for his eventual children, my grandchildren, a plan Eleanor and I had made and buried and never once told him about, because we'd wanted it to be a surprise for a very different kind of day than this one. and a short letter in Eleanor's handwriting, addressed simply to Dean, someday. I let him read it alone. I stood outside the barn in the cold October air while my son sat on an overturned stool and read his mother's handwriting for the first time in 2 years. And when he came out 20 minutes later, his face was wrecked in a way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with grief finally finding its proper shape. "You were always going to leave me something," he said. "This whole time. Even after everything. Your mother and I decided a long time ago that love and trust aren't the same thing," I said. "I still loved you the day you swung that hammer. I trusted you a great deal less. Both of those things were true at once, and I needed you to understand the difference before I ever showed you this." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. We stood together at the edge of the broken concrete for a long while, the same floor that had once held both his worst act and his mother's best intentions, 6 inches apart the entire time, and neither of us had known. The debt ledger still sits on my desk today. $141,000 remaining, projected payoff sometime in the spring of 2029, 3.5 years from now. Dean still works Thursdays at my bench, still clocks in 30 minutes early at the warehouse, still lives in the studio apartment he doesn't know, I quietly own. Jessica moved to Burlington in September, chasing a comeback that hasn't come. Frank still drops by most evenings with a six-pack he mostly doesn't open, and still tells me, every so often, that I've become a harder man than the one who moved in next door to him 11 years ago. I don't think that's entirely true. I think I've only become a more precise one, and there's a difference between hardness and precision that took me an entire ruined workshop and one buried steel box to finally understand. My apprentice, a 17-year-old named Sam Ortiz, who aged out of foster care in June and found his way to my bench through the scholarship fund, asked me once why I hadn't just forgiven Dean outright and moved on, the way people do in the stories he'd grown up hearing. "Because forgiveness without accountability isn't mercy," I told him. "It's just a faster way of teaching someone that consequences are optional. Real mercy takes longer than that. It's supposed to." He thought about that for a long moment, sanding a scrap of pine at his own bench the exact way Dean once had, tongue caught between his teeth in concentration, and said, simply, "I think that's the truest thing anyone's ever told me." I stood in my rebuilt workshop that evening, watching the last light of a Vermont autumn come slanting gold through the windows. Eleanor once picked out herself. My son working quietly at the bench beside mine, my grandson's future already written into a deed that had waited patiently underground for 2 years to be found, and I understood, finally, that complete victory and complete peace are not the same thing either. But for the first time since the sledgehammer came down, I no longer needed them to be.